When it comes to understanding the dynamics of World War II, approach to battle training the Indian Army during the Second World War offers a unique and enlightening perspective. In this podcast episode, we welcome Alan Jeffries, historian and head of collections at the Imperial War Museum in London, to discuss his insightful work. Jeffries' research highlights the crucial yet often overlooked aspect of training within the Indian Army during World War II. We'll explore his methods for gathering sources, the impact of personal soldier accounts, and the specific training manuals and doctrines that shaped the Indian Army. Join us for a thought-provoking conversation on the Indian Army training evolution and its significant role during and after World War II.
My name's Alan Jeffries. I'm the author of Approach to Battle and also the head of equipment and uniform at the National Army Museum.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I've had the pleasure to be sent a number of your books by Helion Press, and I've enjoyed both. Obviously, today we're talking about Approach to Battle training the Indian Army during the Second World War. I just though want to ask you, if you don't mind, before we get into the book, how did you end up where you are, working where you are? What sparked your interest into history and what brought you even into this kind of area in the first place?
Yeah, I've always been interested in history. I really enjoyed it at school and did it at university. And then I after leaving university, I got a job in the Imperial War Museum, and I applied to do masters in war studies at King's College London. And originally my original interest was the First World War, the British Army. But at the time there were so many historians seemed to be working on the First World War. And I read a book on the Second World War campaign in Malaya, and found it was predominantly Indian Army who were fighting in Malaya. So so my interest stemmed from there, and I've been studying the Indian Army for the last almost 30 years, I think.
Oh wow, that's amazing. Then just, I guess, starting with the questions that we had prepared, why do you think it's important to focus on the Indian Army just in the first place?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think in the 1990s, there were very few historians looking at the Indian Army. But that situation is very much remedied now. I mean, loads of historians since then, particularly about the First World War, have looked at the important role of global role of the Indian Army in both World Wars, really. And my interest, I suppose, was I originally started looking at the campaigns in Southeast Asia, Malaya and Burma, Myanmar, and realised that predominantly the troops fighting were Indian soldiers, and I didn't think that really came out in the historical narrative on the whole. Tended to generally concentrate more on the British experience. Again, I think that has been covered very much so by historians in the 21st century. But even now, I think the experience of African soldiers in the Burma campaign, for example, is still it's largely forgotten.
No, definitely. Your book then, Approach to Battle, is focusing on training the Indian Army during the Second World War. And it's a rather unique perspective in that it's focusing on the training aspect of the army. Why was that an important narrative to kind of bring out and put more so in the forefront?
Well, again, I think training wasn't really something that a lot of historians looked at when I started, although I have to say that's not the case now. Most historians factor in training in military historians factor in training in their work. But I think training is really important. Basically, it's the foundation to make an effective fighting force. Kind of simple as that, and very important, I think, for building morale as well at the same time. Training together, fighting together. So I'd say they would be the two essential parts of training.
For those listening, do you mind just perhaps in a nutshell kind of explaining what went on in the particular time frame that you study in terms of training and actually the change on the Indian Army? So like, what were perhaps some of the biggest differences once the training had kind of been done by these soldiers, and how did that help then perhaps in the Second World War?
I think training in the 1930s, there was a pamphlet came out called the Field Service Regulations, which was the basis for all training across all Commonwealth armies. But for example, it didn't really have much on, say, jungle warfare. And in India in the 1930s, 1930s mainly, but a bit earlier as well. There was training specifically for the Northwest Frontier and as an aid to civil power. And certainly at battalion level and above, training becomes much more important in India in the 1930s. So I think, and there's some officers who are commanding battalions in the 30s who are very professional and make training a very important part of commanding their battalions. And these officers in the 30s go on to become divisional commanders in the Second World War. To talk about one officer in particular, Gertie Tucker, he commands his battalion in the 30s in the Gurkhas. His methods are seen as very efficient and end up actually being used across India by the end of the 1930s. He then becomes Director of Military Training at GHQ India at the beginning of the Second World War, and puts in place training for mountain warfare, jungle warfare, as well as open warfare, as well as Northwest Frontier and aid to civil power, which the official doctrine is actually produced under his period at the Military Training Directorate. So I think he's very influential. And then he is actually in a position to put a lot of his ideas into practice, because he then becomes commander of 4th Indian Division, North Africa. So certainly in the Western theatres during the Second World War, Francis, his name is Francis Tucker, he was nicknamed Gertie. He is extremely influential in firstly GHQ India, then in North Africa, but also in the Italian campaign as well. And he's invalided out from Italy. When he goes back to India, he does a quite important report on frontier warfare, and using the ideas of mountain warfare that he'd learned in his division had learned in North Africa, also previously in East Africa, and as well as the Italian campaign. So I suppose he's just one example. There are others, and maybe I'll talk about them in a later question.
Well, that actually brings me nicely to the next question, which is, in your research, how did these personal stories and accounts of individual soldiers perhaps enhance your understanding, but also give you different perspectives?
One of the things with training is obviously it's not the most exciting of pastimes. So generally, in the personal papers, the memoirs, that kind of thing, training is very rarely mentioned. But what's nice is that occasionally it is, and then you can back up the official sources in your research. But coming to another individual, Reginald Savory, his papers are at the National Army Museum, and they've been there since 1976. Hardly any historians have ever looked at them. And he was director of infantry from 1943 to 45, and he's extremely influential on the training of infantry during the Second World War. What's great about his papers, though, is that not only has the official papers, say, for example, that are also in Tucker's papers, but he also has, there's some great letters to his wife and his parents and that kind of thing. So it gives you a really good sort of idea of what he was thinking as well at the same time, and how hard he was working, and that kind of thing, which I found quite unusual in most private papers, because generally it's more the official papers.
Were in any of the papers there any kind of indication from the Indian soldiers about their role as imperial soldiers, or like as in they're soldiers of the empire rather than perhaps of India, if that makes sense? Like as in, was there anything that indicated they were kind of questioning perhaps this new training or new role that they were going to have to start perhaps not a new role, but as in more so, I guess I'm also looking at it with hindsight in that we know then the Second World War comes soon after it. But was there any indication from any of the soldiers about, I guess, any disgruntledness or kind of just like, meh, I'm not quite enjoying this, or I don't like this change?
Most definitely. I think there are censor reports from most of the Second World War theatres, and in quite a few of them. They're only sort of edited snippets to see what morale was like within the units, but there's definitely disgruntlement in all the theatres in some shape or form. What I'm sort of not so much in, you don't really see so much disgruntlement about training, for example, but it's more about the political culture, lack of food or problems back home, that kind of thing. Sorry, there's one other point I was going to make and forgot about. Oh yes, and also one of the things I should talk about is Indianization. So in the interwar period, a number of Indian officers become commissioned into the Indian Army. So in the First World War, it was only medical officers who were Indian, and then from sort of early 1920, 21 onwards, Indians are commissioned, but the numbers are tiny. There's roughly about 400 officers by just over 400 by 1939. But this increases to over 15,000 by 1945, so it's a huge number. But what I have read in some of the memoirs, especially from the regular officers, Indian regular officers, they questioned their whether fighting the army was sort of against nationalist India, and whether this was an issue. And some of them, like General Rudra, actually is advised by Gandhi that obviously an army is needed after the war, so after independence, and this. So I think that sort of some Indian officers see that as quite important, and obviously and reinforces their time in the army.
Just going back to what you were mentioning about the officers in World War One and World War Two, like, as in, do you just mind explaining that?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So the only commissioned officers, fairly much, were pretty much in the Indian Medical Service during the First World War. So all the Indian troops were led by British commissioned officers, and then there's a level between the officers and the soldiers called Viceroy commissioned officers. They're vital link, but they're not commissioned. They're called Viceroy commissioned officers, and I think they still exist in the army today. They're called junior commissioned officers, and basically that link between the soldiers and the British officers makes the Indian Army of both world wars actually work. I think without it, probably wouldn't have done. Particularly when some of the British officers coming in didn't even know the language of the soldiers.
Yeah. So just to clarify, then, in the First World War, all of those soldiers who were from the Indian Army were led by British soldiers, but the difference was in the Second World War, there were Indian soldiers leading but there were Indian generals, or however the word is, leading other Indian soldiers.
Yeah,
so that was the difference. Okay.
There's much more Indian officers during the Second World War, but even in the Second World War, the highest ranking officer in the field was a Brigadier Timaya. Brigadier Cariappa is also of a similar level, and who goes on to become Commander-in-Chief India in the late 1940s. And there are higher ranking officers. For example, Heraji Kirtiji, his medals and a lot of his collections actually at the National Army Museum. He is the first Major General, Indian Major General in the Second World War Indian Army. I think he's promoted in 1941.
Okay. Okay, that definitely helps and puts it into perspective. So thank you for that. Then moving on. Earlier you mentioned there was a training manual that had quite a immediate impact on the army, and it was created by the soldier you were telling us about. Were there any other manuals or doctrines that had perhaps a similar impact, or even an impact that's perhaps been overlooked by historians and it's only now being kind of understood?
So yeah, I mean, the one I sort of want to concentrate on was originally written by Tuka, MTP number 9. It was on jungle warfare. It was only 11 pages long, and it was produced during the Malayan campaign. And that was basically as an addendum to field service regulations, which only had like a page or two on jungle warfare. So it's a very small pamphlet, and we don't quite know how many people read it in the early campaigns and in Malaya and Burma. It wasn't that influential. But what then, because of the experience in those campaigns, later editions are produced. So, for example, this is Military Training Pamphlet number 9. This is the 3rd edition, published in August 1942, after the retreat from Burma. And this is very important. It was used by, for example, 5th Indian Division. They'd been fighting in the Middle East and North Africa, and they come back to India in 1943 to train for the Burma campaign. And they use this pamphlet, and they call it the Bible for jungle tactics. But the doctrine is finally, jungle warfare doctrine is finally sort of produced in September 1943 with a booklet, a training manual called the Jungle Book. This, I don't have an example to show, unfortunately, but it had cartoons, it had pictures for the first time to make it more popular with the soldiers. And it not only used all the lessons from Malaya and Burma, but also from the first Arakan, where the Indian troops, British and Indian troops, had come up across Japanese bunkers for the first time. So there were big sections on bunker busting in there. And basically it was the doctrine, and that was used for the remainder of the Second World War, and also used for British Army doctrine produced in 1944-45 for those soldiers who were going to come out from the UK to Burma. The British Liberation Army that was fighting in Northwest Europe was also nicknamed the BLA, Burma Looms Ahead.
This is just my curiosity getting the better of me, but were there any incidents that occurred on the battlefield that could be tied back to the strategy that the army was following at the time, whether that's a success or a defeat? Was there anything that was kind of like a clear example of they followed this strategy or idea that was in one of these pamphlets, and it's led to something, whether that's a defeat or a victory doesn't quite matter, but as in I'm just interested in kind of understanding how some of that may have played out in reality?
Yeah, so I mean, so for example, like the doctrine training for bunker busting. Yeah, so initially, the 5th Indian Division, they're fighting in the Arakan and in slowly going to Burma. And there's this myth of the Japanese Superman, and that they were great jungle fighters. So what the Indian Army does is sort of gradually adapts the soldiers to fighting in the jungle, gets the British and Indian soldiers to slowly adapt to fighting in the jungle. So they basically, go on fighting patrols, and then and increase their knowledge, and also what it's like to fight in the jungle. And then they use some of the techniques described in the training manuals for defeating the Japanese in the bunkers. So the infantry would be supported by artillery or tanks, and they use different shells to loosen up the the bunkers, go slowly in, then use machine guns. Then they'd support the infantry going in, and then once the infantry had taken the bunkers, then they would support the they would attack the inevitable Japanese counterattack. And this is all sort of quite clearly laid out in the training literature.
How did the Indian Army's approach perhaps differ to training for other Commonwealth armies at the time, or was it like a blanket policy?
No. So India, I think, really pioneers jungle warfare doctrine, for example. Generally, at the beginning of the war, field service regulations is the doctrine across all the Commonwealth armies. But however, so there are sort of subtle differences. So in the Indian Army, no training instructions were allowed to be issued quite early on. I think it's around about 1940-41. Whereas in the Indian Army, training instructions are issued across nearly all Indian Army divisions, whether they're fighting in Italy, North Africa, or the Burma campaign. And these training instructions are vital because basically after a formation goes into action, they encapsulate all the lessons learned from those actions, put them in the training instruction, and then and that's what they use for going forward. And these training instructions are issued fairly regularly and across all Indian Army divisions, certainly from 1943 onwards. And I think they're really they're very important. Earlier on, the training instructions actually use material from the training pamphlets issued at GHQ India, and then these training instructions inform later editions of those training pamphlets, so that when they get updated, the experience in the field basically updates the doctrine produced centrally across the Indian Army. So that's extremely important. I haven't looked at all the Commonwealth armies, but say for the British Army, this doesn't happen. So I think that's probably a good example. I mean, they learn and adapt as well, the British Army, but in a different way.
What were perhaps some of the ways that the Indian culture factored into how the training was either taught, or like were there certain factors that had to kind of be whittled down to fit the Indian culture? As in, like, what were some of was there anything actually that was influenced perhaps by the way that the Indian culture was at the time?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the training was going on Eastern Command, and I think India's at quite a low ebb at that time because of the Quit India movement, which is in response to the Cripps mission, which was led by the Labour politician Sir Stafford Cripps, trying to persuade the Indian politicians to support the war in turn for autonomy. But those are, unsurprisingly rejected, and but it meant that a lot of soldiers were involved in the Quit India movement. And then, of course, at the similar time, there's the tragic Bengal famine, and the figures for that are just incredibly. I mean, I've seen figures of 3 million people dying in the Bengal famine from 1943 to 44. The army was involved in helping out with food, but it's just a tragic episode. So I think India was at a really low ebb in 1943, 44.
I guess one question that is always interesting to ask is, what was perhaps some of the most surprising finds during your research, or perhaps something that you didn't expect to come across as you dug through the historical archive?
Yeah, I saw this question. It's funny, I didn't have too many. I mean, it was always nice when you're researching and it sort of all joins up and you think, so and so was doing this at the same time as someone else. That's really nice. I think the most surprising thing was that when I first started, military historians weren't looking at training, perhaps to the extent that they are now, which is great to say. And also the other one is that, there wasn't as much interest in the Indian Army when I first started, whereas now there very much is, which is also, great to see.
My last question on the list is, and how do you think the training changes that you described influenced the Indian Army post the Indian Army's post-war evolution, because obviously it's quite clear that, like, as in, well, not clear to everyone, but as in end of Second World War, and then independence comes a couple of years after, and so a lot of the Indian Army would have had experience in the Second World War, so there are like some rather obvious links between them. But what I guess in relation to the training that you described, what was perhaps some of the most influential parts of that were literally carried over into independent India?
So I think that's going to be an interesting thing, and strange enough, that's one of the areas that I'm going to be looking at in my next book. I think it's very important because obviously, the few of the things I'm planning to look at is, for example, so a lot of these officers, Indian officers, who end up going to the armies of Pakistan and India, often were, had fought together during the war, and then almost immediately fighting against each other in Kashmir. What on the training aspect, I have seen training manuals from the late 1940s, early 1950s in India, and they look remarkably similar to the Second World War version. So I think they just, I think a lot of what's learned during the war, it continues in the at least till the end of the early 1950s in the Indian Army. I haven't done so much research on the army in Pakistan yet, but I'm hoping to look at that. I think it'd be quite interesting to see that transition from a colonial army to the independent armies of both India and Pakistan, and see how much is carried on. Or I think it's going to be an interesting research project.
Well, I'm looking forward to that book because it gives me another excuse to host you again and discuss another work. And for those who are still listening and have made it to this far, we will have another podcast with yourself about your other book, which was The Indian Army in the First World War, which, although I have read through it, I found the Second World War book more interesting, so hence why I've been doing that one first. There's no rhyme or reason otherwise. But no, I just wanted to say thank you for your time. I've gotten through all the questions that we had prepared. I just want to double check, is there anything that you think is worth mentioning or that we haven't covered that you would like to include before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I wrote down notes to all your questions.
Because we kind of like jumped through some of them. Yeah, no, go ahead, please.
Some of them, yeah. I thought maybe sources quite interesting because the Indian Army, what's quite interesting, and maybe this would be a nice one to finish off. So for British and Indian officers, the records are actually held at the British Library, which I think is a fascinating resource that perhaps people would not know about, and they're easily accessible. But they've only become accessible in recent years. I mean, when I first started the research, they weren't accessible. Really interesting source. I mean, most of my material came from the British Library, the India Office Library records, also from the National Army Museum, which is pretty much the National Museum of the Indian Army pre-1947, and also a bit of research in New Delhi at the National Archives of India, and the Nehru Museum and Memorial Library as well, which was they had some great private papers there. For example, Brigadier Tamaya, who I mentioned, and also the United Service Institution of India in New Delhi had a really good library, and quite a few training manuals that I didn't find in the UK. So I think it was great to be able to go out to India and just find some extra material, and I hope to do again.
No, that's amazing. I always find it interesting, the question on sources, because it's always fascinating to find out where and also how far source material can be, as in terms of like, I know in this case it's India and the UK, which to some listeners isn't like that exotic or whatever, but some people have given such crazy answers, and like some of the countries that they've ended up in to find source material, you would never have imagined it or never even have thought that the material could get that far. Just when you mentioned about the World War records at the British Library, why were they not like accessible earlier on? Was that just because they hadn't been made accessible, or was there like time restrictions on things?
It might be, yeah, but a bit of both, I think, maybe.
Oh, okay.
No,
Okay.
I'm not totally sure, but it, it's great now because you find in those records, there's all sorts of material I think that the historians haven't really looked at. So I think they're great for historians, but also perhaps family historians as well.
Yes, no, definitely. It's definitely piqued my curiosity because I'm sure there's a treasure trove of information that is like lying in all of that. So, no, thank you. We've spent, I don't know how long, probably just under an hour going through all of that. I can only thank you for your time. It's been absolutely brilliant, and I'm looking forward to doing this again for your other books too. But yeah, thank you. I just wanted to check, is that everything? Is there anything else that you just wanted to mention or anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think so. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. The current notes come. Yeah, I think I've covered most things from your questions anyway, and I can't think of anything specifically. I suppose I just want to finish off that one of the main sort of conclusions of my book was that the Indian Army by 1945 was a learning institution. There was officered by very professional officers, both British and Indian, who could adapt to pretty much any situation. The divisions in Burma, for example, were proficient in jungle warfare. Then the open warfare, the plains of Burma. Also, the troops in Italy fighting in mountain warfare. So across the Indian Army, Indian soldiers could adapt to pretty much any tactical situation that they came across. And by 1945, the Indian Army was an extremely professional army.
And on that conclusion, we shall conclude. So thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thanks very much.